We understand that many people on President's Day are not off of work, so we're recording for those who can't attend. Dina Dmalchusa Dina is one of those rare misoras, part of our halachic practice that everybody seems to be aware of. It's an Aramaic term that almost everybody knows, and they apply it throughout their lives all the time. Correctly, incorrectly, we'll soon see. I want to open with two things today. So last night I had a dinner for the Telz Yeshiva alumni where I work as the Menahel each and every day. And, this is a yeshiva that I, as a student, could never get into. Even now, I couldn't get into. The Bachram from 9th grade already know a tremendous amount more than I do in everything. That's all they do. 18 hours a day, you give them a break. You have to schlep them to the gym. It's a big fight to get them to go to the gym because they just want to have free time. I'll learn Masechtas Mikvos. And their schedule is very full. And they don't get to spend time with the Rosh Yeshiva until they're in Beis Medrash. Then you graduate into his class. Of course, once a year, he'll test them. And each of their grades, they have a Rebbe. 9th grade Rebbe, as we all know, 10th, 11th. Their 11th grade Rebbe, who was there from the genesis of Riverdale when it wasn't Staten Island and before that New Jersey, his name is Rabbi Goldberg. Very, very special person. If you know the Goldberg brothers from Chicago, each one of them is very special. Moshe Goldberg in Toronto started a famous journal. He worked at Or HaChaim, the Mizrahi yeshiva there. Just a person with always a smile on his face. The other brother, Rabbi Goldberg in Eretz Yisrael, was famous with David Cohen in Eretz Yisrael, collecting money for the poor of the poor. I used to give a lot of money to them from Matanas Lavionamos, Chitim. They would take you around to show you how some people lived. You would be shocked that in 2022, there are families that have such little funds that they live in mamash squalor. And they all died young, these brothers. And Yehuda Goldberg, this year, first he had COVID, then he got the disease, similar diseases to his siblings, and he died in the middle of 11th grade, meaning these are students, and he was, I can't do it justice. So they had this video, the 17-minute video, the entire event was in his honor. And although I never give to my alumni from my RDF for his zikaron and for help his family, this was a good tzedakah, so everybody here also gave in a sense. So at the beginning of the dinner, they showed a video and it was very emotional. And then the Rosh Yeshiva gets up to speak. Now the Rosh Yeshiva, if you know the Haredi world and even just the Torah world in general, very famous. Someone who stands strongly on principle. He's very close to Willig. In fact, Willig was in the video last night talking about Rabbi Goldberg used to give a shir in the Young Israel Riverdale. Every Shavuos, he would leave the yeshiva and give a 2-hour in-depth shir. And they interviewed Balabatim and they said, we didn't come for the lumdus because most of us didn't understand it because I wouldn't understand it. He was brilliant. But then he would regale us with story after story. And the whole Shavuos, the husbands and wives, all they were talking about was what he spoke about. So it was very nice. And Sirah Willig was very nice. In any event, so at that point, the yeshiva gets up. And again, the yeshiva is not someone who speaks generally. He speaks in the yeshiva. He gives a shir every day in Yiddish. And Shalosh Shudas, if you ever make the mistake of going to Riverdale for Shalosh Shudas, his shir could last 2 hours. They finish at least 2 hours. Havdalahs 2 hours after Shabbos, and it's in Yiddish as well. Although that's a little bit more stories and ideas. But a regular speech that we would call a speech, a 30, 40-minute. It's not something he does. It's certainly not in English. But last night he did, and everybody was very emotional because of this video of this great and holy tzaddik, Rabbi Goldberg. And he started off by saying, the world is in chaos. And, just to hear him speak in English is a little bit rattling, although he's an American boy. The world is in chaos. And he spoke about truckers in Canada in his opening, those that are protesting, those that are against the protests, taking gas, and people are split. He spoke openly. I couldn't believe he said it. He happens to be, I don't think I'm speaking out of school, pro the vaccine. He got the vaccine right away. I happen to have spoken to him about certain issues, about renting certain spaces for the yeshiva students. And I said, but they're going to have to be vaccinated. He was shocked to discover, or to want to discover, is it really true when I told him that not all the younger students are vaccinated? But yet he got up and he said, in the vaccine, there are those that, of course, embrace it. There are those who question its efficacy, believing that institutions, both government and pharmaceutical, are in it more for the money or blinded by the money. Politics in this country are divided. There are always differences. There are always people on the right and people on the left, but never like this. Never like this. And of course, COVID. He spoke about that there is a tremendous cloud of midas hadin in the world, that God's character of justice is out there. And he said, it was very painful to listen to. He says, every week I go to a Shiva house, and not a Shiva house of an older person, Shiva house of a young person. He said, just today, he was coming from a Shiva house of an 18-year-old bacher. And it wasn't the first one of the week, a young boy. And that family buried a baby a few years earlier. And started to, and this is not his style. I've been to other dinners. He doesn't usually talk like this. He started to cry, and he had to stop and start. And he said he'd left, and he said to his son when they were leaving the Shiva house and repeating it publicly, I told my son, even the Malach HaMaves himself, the angel of death himself, held this 18-year-old yeshiva bacher, this pure neshama, to Hashem and said, Ad Masa. Till when? I can't do this anymore. Said the Malach HaMaves. It's too much din. So, of course, he wasn't going to end on this, so he wanted to speak about Simcha. Our relationship with Torah, there's a person who sits and learns Daf Yomi because they have to, and the person who does Daf Yomi, they're excited. Who buys a lulav has excitement, not something that you have to do. Bring Simcha back into our lives. That's the only way to counter din. And he spoke about those two relationships with Hashem. But when he said this idea that we have no trust in government institutions, when a president of either party says something, at least half the country is not just disagrees, is cynical as to their intent. He said a country can't go on like this, which is very true. So I think this morning talking about Dina Dmalchusa Dina is important for that reason alone. That halacha sanctions and embraces and accepts and internalizes the words of governments at times. Not always, but at times. And for all the Republicans watching, that applies to Biden. And for all the Democrats watching, it applies to Trump. And as painful as that is to hear, and why is the rabbi getting into politics? Well, I think we can't be in denial. I mean, families have been irrevocably fractured due to COVID politics and due to Washington politics. Shul dynamics have been shattered because of this. People don't talk to each other. I really believe we shouldn't be talking about politics in shul. We should really try to do that. Certainly in the Beis HaKnesses, that's a prohibition in Shulchan Aruch, but in the building at all or by family simchas. But all that being said, maybe at the very least, some of the deserved cynicism could stay, but the undeserved cynicism we could take away today by talking about this concept of governmental regulations having purchase within halacha. And with that, I want to start with a video. Now, usually, the last time we had a shir was Memorial Day, one of the major weekends. We had some 50, 60 online and about the same crowd here. So I wanted to do something this morning that benefits those online more than those here, but we don't have the same numbers online. But nevertheless, I'm going to share a video. I hope my screen is being shared right now. Okay, so you could all listen if you can't see. The Drings, could you give me a thumbs up if you can see the video? I know you can't hear it yet. You can give me a thumbs up. Okay, you're always the ones I see on my screen. Okay, everybody listen. Hopefully this will work.
We can see a social media firestorm, a woman calling the police about an 8-year-old girl selling bottled water. Their interaction sparking an intense debate. Here's ABC's Adrian Banker.
Tonight, a controversial call.
This woman don't want to let a little girl sell some water. She called police on an 8-year-old little girl.
This woman on the phone with police about an 8-year-old girl she says was loudly selling water outside her apartment for hours. The child's mom confronting the caller.
She comes out, demands the permit for my daughter. She said if we didn't give it to her, then she'd call the cops. So I said, okay, call the cops. And she did.
The lady called the police on me because I didn't have a permit.
Well, you can hide all you want. The whole world gonna see you, boo.
Yeah, and illegally selling water without a permit? This the scene in a residential neighborhood near San Francisco's AT&T Park Friday. Aaron Austin shared the video on Instagram. It's now been seen hundreds of thousands of times. The woman on the phone, Allison Edel, tells ABC News she never spoke to the little girl, but says her building security guard first tried to get the girl and her mom to keep the noise down or move, saying she did phone the police, but not to report them. She simply wanted to know if what they were doing was legal. Austin posting this new video on Instagram showing her daughter selling water again.
Okay,
And Edel says she
I'm
never
gonna
made
stop
any racist comments.
the sharing. So what do we think about this? Was
Terrible.
right? Was the neighbor right? Does anybody want to support the neighbor? I mean, I know I'm putting you,
Are you afraid to support?
right, I know people are going to be afraid.
It's the mother of the child. It's not the child that's being responsible.
Okay, whoever it is. So I wanted to start with this video when now we're getting into the meat of potatoes, because halacha is absolute. When we use terminology in an argument, this is Dina Dmalchusa Dina, and you want to demonstrate your allegiance and your fidelity to that principle. Halacha is binary. Either something is true or it's not true. You can't be a little bit pregnant. So we cannot utilize this halacha when we need and not when we don't need. So if Dina Dmalchusa Dina is an absolute, like many people may, if you would ask them, is it an absolute? They would say, absolutely, it's an absolute. Then you would ask them, well, what about a child? You know, one of my, I don't have a sweet tooth, but there are a few things that are sweet that I love. You know, I love Napoleon dessert. I love pecan pie. There's very few. One of the things I absolutely love is shaved ice with syrup. With, you know, I love that. Especially, I would sometimes get myself thirsty and riled up in the summertime just so I could enjoy one of those even more. And at least once a year, my neighbors, the wax stocks, they sell on the street. I think for Chai, Lifeline, or for Wonderful Chesed, they do this. Now, this is probably illegal. Probably illegal. Should I call the cops? Should I take Yakir to the side, or Ozzy, or Ilan, or Rami to the side and say, you know, boys, as your Rav, I have a responsibility to teach you halacha, Dina Dmalchusa Dina, and this you don't have the permits. So it's already now difficult because we want to apply it when we want to apply it, but we don't want to apply it when it's not a desire of ours. And we have to remember the words in Pirkei Avos and throughout Chazal that how dangerous it is to use Torah as a weapon. What does it mean to use Torah as a weapon? You know, I could probably hurt someone a little bit with this chumash. I can't knock them out. Using with a weapon means you, like a bad family member or spouse, you want to get everything good from Judaism, right? I want Yom Tif, I want the Seder, you know, I want all the good things. You know, usually this is husbands. You know, they want the wife, they want the children. They want the nice Shabbos table, but they also want to still have a good time with their friends. They don't want to give up anything to get that. And in Yiddishkeit, it's the same way. It's an unhealthy, toxic, abusive relationship where we utilize it when it's good for us and discard it when it's not. And that's called using Torah as a weapon. Because you have an opinion, I'm going to throw out Dina Dmalchusa Dina. It has to be absolute, but that does not mean, we'll see, that it will apply necessarily to the girl selling water on the street. We'll talk about it. In fact, it will be much easier if we look at this class this morning discussing one case, like bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is Geneva. In halacha, if I owe you money, there's no route for me to say I declare bankruptcy, and yet Dina Dmalchusa Dina says it does exist. So I could use that as our center of gravity. We could use the case of the young girl selling lemonade. We could use mandates, which I'm sure will get me in trouble no matter what I say. We could use the chaos in Canada, the truckers protest and strike. So we'll go back to all of those, but keep in mind any of those 3 or 4 examples that I gave, because Dina Dmalchusa Dina is a country unto itself. It's vast, and we should center it in one of those questions. So we'll use all of those examples. I want to begin with 2 things now that we're getting into the halacha with all that introduction. The first one is a Shulchan Aruch. Again, the idea of using Torah as a weapon, this unhealthy relationship, the embracing of Dina Dmalchusa Dina when it suits us, but ignoring it when it comes to a lemonade stand. Maybe we should do that, but how does that work? So let's open up with number 1 in the source sheets. a Shulchan Aruch that we should all read at least once a month. I try to quote it at least once a year in shul. The Shulchan Aruch, we always say, does not editorialize. Several times he does. This is one of them. The Halacha of Dina Dmalchus. We shouldn't use the laws of the Gentiles to rule halachically. Asar, it is forbidden ladon b'fnei dayanim akum u'ba'arko shalhem. It is forbidden to appear. You can look at the translations for trial before non-Jewish judges and in their courts of law. Afilu b'din shadonim b'dinei Yisrael, even when they somewhat mirror our laws. Va'afilu nisratzu shtei baledinim, you and your Jewish neighbor agree to arbitration, or in this case, going to a secular court. L'dam b'fneim aser. It's forbidden. Now, wait for this. V'chol haba, and anybody who comes, l'dam b'fneim, and chooses, instead of going to a Rav, finding out what the Kso says, what Tosva says, what Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra says, Harei zeh rasha, they are wicked, u'ke'ilu chiruf, v'gidov, it's as if they blasphemed, reproached, v'horim yad, and raised their hand, rebelled, b'toras Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashem. That is a very powerful line. Now, does that mean that one can never go to court? Of course you go to court. But if you have a disagreement with a friend in shul and, about lent money, whatever it may be, and you bypass the rabbi or you bypass a beis din, and the obvious option is to go to a court of law, that is absolutely forbidden. Again, this is not a shir on our coast, on secular courts. Are there times that two Jewish frum litigants can go to court? Yes, but it's never because in our mind we think that, I'll turn to the rabbi when it comes to pots and pans. You know why? Because there's nobody on Fifth Avenue who knows those laws. He's the only one. It doesn't exist anymore. But if there's a law that, the rabbi, has this archaic knowledge from the Talmud, and there's a guy who went to Harvard and learned what some arbitrary legislative professionals wrote by their, assistants 30 years ago that no one read, that I'm going to trust. Not to mention that much of American law was predicated on Common and Roman law, which was predicated on Talmudic law, which is a shir for a different time. There's no question that our system of contractual law, et cetera, predates almost all laws. But that doesn't make a difference. We have to be aware there's an entire corpus of law called Choshei Mishpat. So when we talk about Dina Dmalchusa Dina, the first thing you have to know before you start is that we do have laws that are about zoning, where you're allowed to sell, what you're allowed to sell, about hiring and firing, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, go ahead.
This that you say that even for divorce also?
For divorce is a whole different discussion. There are times that you have to go. Of course, you have to go to a court for divorce. It's best, first of all, you need to get a civil divorce. But for the division of funds, it can be done through a beis din. It can be done through a secular court. A Rav has to be involved. There are many times it has to go to secular court. You have to speak to a Rav before you do. It's not always awesome. I don't want to get into a conversation just about secular courts. That's a subject unto itself. But the point is made. The first mistake people have to get rid of is Dina Dmalchusa Dina is not like, because Judaism is about Shabbos, it's about making Kiddush, it's about, saying Vayibin Zaharon. When it comes to financial matters, you go after American law. That's not the way to look at it. We should be very proud of our system. If it makes you feel any better, it sure makes me feel better. Why was I speaking at Harvard Law School 3 years ago? One reason. They wanted to hear halachic views that associate with American law and how they interact. Menachem has been at the forefront at Harvard University bringing that in, and it's well attended, and they appreciate it. We should appreciate it. When Menachem asked me to do it, I wasn't sure. He goes, there's one thing you could always do, Rabbi. I said, well, he goes, now you could always say in any CV, a Harvard speaker. It's great. He was right. It's great. So now look at number 2. To that point, look at what Rabbi Schachter says. So Rabbi Schachter wrote an article on Dina Dmalchusa Dina. It's if you know how Rabbi Schachter writes very broadly. So it's if you want to, it's from the early 80s. You could read it. It's a very general overview, but it says something very important. This is from the RJJ Journal of Contemporary Halacha. Before proceeding with an analysis of the specifics of the principle of Dina Dmalchusa Dina, we ought to point out that this is a much more narrow concept than is often imagined. Dina Dmalchusa Dina cannot be interpreted to mean that the law of the land is the law, period. Were this so, it would mean that wherever the law of the land is different from the law of the Torah, it is the law of the land which we are to follow. This is, of course, absurd, for it would reduce Judaism to a practice of rituals alone and would effectively nullify about half of the Shulchan Aruch. Rather, we take the principle Dina Dmalchusa Dina to indicate that in certain areas and under certain specific circumstances, the halacha requires that we be governed by the dictates of the sovereign state in which we live, rather than by the teachings of Torah alone. We'll now consider some of those areas. So now we have a very nice footing. We understand that Dina Dmalchusa Dina doesn't come to uproot the Torah. We understand that it's narrow. We understand that halacha is absolute, and if we apply it, how do we do that? Do we apply it to the kids selling? I was telling someone in the shul, when the elevator breaks, there are certain laws of putting signs outside the building according to the Disabilities Act stating such. We don't do that. Then everybody knows you don't do that. But it's Dina Dmalchusa Dina. What about speeding? You're driving on the highway. There are no cops, and it's 2 a.m, and the weather is crisp, and the speed limit is 65. I want to go 66. Is that also? Again, halacha is absolute. And then number 3, the point we made is we cannot have it emotionally, intellectually ever overwhelm, eclipse, subsume the true halacha in our eyes, the true monetary law, which is the Torah. So with that, let's ask a question before we go on. Now, with all that footing, we have to ask a philosophical question which relates to this law, but really with law in general. Before we discuss, or to begin discussing Dina Dmalchusa Dina, you have to ask yourself the following question: what is authority? Anybody who has taken philosophy 101 in university has had many courses on this. I'll ask it differently. Why do you keep the law? Why don't you cheat on your taxes? Why don't you, I don't know, why don't you break a trademark? Why don't you steal from a store? What authority does the government have? And by what authority do you think they have that causes you to keep law?
Prison.
So it's coercion. That is a view. There is a view that there's no moral right, according to Joe. The only reason why we keep law is because we are coerced to do so. So therefore, if the government says we are no longer going to prison anybody, which is pretty much where we're getting to in New York City, then there's no moral obligation to keep halacha. So this is actually a very difficult case. I have a friend of mine, a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, Yale graduate, a philosopher, a lawyer. He's now a philosophy Rebbe, makes it sound better, philosophy professor in London. His name is Ken Ehrenberg, brilliant man, and Talmid Chacham as well. And we were exchanging emails about this topic because when I was at University of Buffalo, I attended his classes on this subject. And if you look in your notes in number 3, I actually list, we don't have time to go through them all, but you can take these notes home. Where does any government derive their power? And we quote from 2 sources, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is the art scroll on philosophical matters. Just by the way, everyone will look something up. And if you turn the page, there's another source that we take, which is the IEP. It's almost like a Wikipedia for philosophy. So if you just turn the page, you'll see what they say. And these are all sourced. So some say it's based out of fairness. Some say it's based out of gratitude. And all of these fall under consent, meaning there's a consensual relationship between us and the government that we accept. Maybe we do this so we live in a fair society. Maybe we do it for selfish reasons. I don't want my home burglared, so I'm going to support a rule that doesn't allow anybody to be stolen from. Then there's associative theories. There's the sensitivity to regime, the weight of political obligation. And this is actually a fascinating concept, which Judaism takes very seriously. Yiddishkeit always asks, by what right are we required to keep the Torah? So we did it without coercion. We did it based on gratitude, out of love, out of a fair society, by saying Nasa v'nishma. But then Hashem held the mountain over our head and said, if you accept it, great, if not, not. To which the Maharal said, there had to be an aspect of coercive authority. Because if we only accepted it through a volunteer nature, then through a volunteer nature could go away and the world won't understand the vitality, the critical nature of Torah. So Judaism, so therefore we had a course as well. Fascinating that Judaism always understood this question of authority of law is essential to understanding of how we keep the law. It's not just why we keep the law. So now that we are turned to that page, we're going to start seeing the sources. I just wanted, before we see the sources, I want to tell you two things. Number one is there's exceptions to every rule. Nobody, if I talk about exceptions to Dina Dmalchusa Dina, nobody should walk away saying Rabbi Taub doesn't take this seriously, or he's saying this because he disagrees with the truckers or supports Trudeau or wants to push mandates, doesn't want to push mandates. Every halacha has exceptions. There's not a person in this room that hasn't at least once driven on Shabbos. Dina Dmalchusa Dina is not more special than Shabbos. It's not the 11th of the 10 commandments. And even if it was, there are exceptions. So if it's a real halacha, it must be treated as such. So there's obviously going to be exceptions. Number two, what we have to think about before we see these sources, because we're going to see the sources and all the discussions that we had for 20 minutes leading up to it, hopefully will have fireworks in your brain of application. What type of country is in authority? We've all read Lord of the Flies. So in Lord of the Flies, right, the plane crashes, they start self-governing. Is that a halacha, Dina Dmalchusa Dina? What do you need, a flag? At what point? You go away on a retreat with your business and they make rules, no leaving your room after 10. Well, they're paying for it. They're your bosses, Dina Dmalchusa Dina. You can't break curfew. In yeshiva, let's say. So there are a lot of difficult, as I told tomorrow after Shachris, this is not a subject, Dina Dmalchusa Dina, it is a world. So now let's see sources. We should, one last point, let me just say, the Ritva says, important to know, that you'll never find in Chazal anybody who disputes this principle. Very important. There are principles in Jewish law that people disagree about. Everybody agrees. We'll see it'll be Shmuel, the first generation Talmudic Amara, who states Dina Dmalchusa Dina. Nobody disagrees. The second point, the last point before we see the sources is it the Araisa or is it the Rabbanim? Very quickly, while the Beis Shmuel, a very important commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, said it's a rabbinical law, the vast super majority all say this has to be biblical law. So the question now is, what is the source? From where does this authority come from? And what is the reason for this law? How do you apply it? And to whom is it applied? A lot of questions. Let's see if in the next 15, 20 minutes, we could get through at least some of them. Let's start with Nidarim. So if this is a source number 6 in your notes, on the first sheet, the second side, last source, the Mishnah says, Nodrim lahargin ulechramim ulemeichsin shehi truma afal pi she'eno truma. So we don't have time to go into all details of this, but if you want, you could just turn to see the translation. If I translated it at all, did I translate it? Oh. All right, so I'll just tell it to you by heart. So you'll turn the page to B'Shvua, B'Shamei lo yiftach le b'neder, B'S Hillel imra'at yiftach le b'Shei. Okay, so we're just turning the page. This is all the Mishnah. So the Mishnah basically says you could lie to a tax collector. You could lie to a tax collector about what produce is truma, meaning what's taxable income. I don't want to get into the details. It's a little bit more precise than that, this Gemara, on what it's talking about and about false vows. But let's focus on that one word, two words, the lying, and to the government authority about taxes. That's what I want you to keep in mind. So to that, the Gemara says, so we're on the second sheet, the first column on the left, says the Gemara, second paragraph. V'ha'amar Shmuel asked the Gemara, what are you talking about? Lie by taxes. But didn't Shmuel say, Dina Dmalchusa Dina? That the law of the kingdom, the law of the Gentile laws, how arbitrary and capricious you may think it is, Dina is the law. Amar Rab Chanina, said Rab Chanina, Amar Rab Kahana, Amar Shmuel, we're talking about b'moches, with a tax collector, she'ein lo kitzva, that has no determinate amount of funds. He could collect whatever he wants. He wants to collect $30 from you. If he thinks you have a nice house, he'll take more money. Rabbi Yanai says, b'moches ayman me'lov, or it might be a tax collector that's not working for the king. You know, the mafia, Kosher Nostra, they're coming, what's the Kosher Nostra? Whatever you call it. They knock on the pizza shop. They say we want 30% of the business for protection. So what we see from here, as the Rambam points out, others point out, there's Dina Dmalchusa Dina, but there's no Geneva Dmalchusa Geneva. A government can't steal. So a government has to have, number one is you have to pay taxes. Very clear from the Gemara. You cannot cheat on taxes. If you have a person privately collecting taxes, like the mafia, of course you could lie at your own risk. We're not saying what you should do, what you can do. Number two, there are times when even a government is so demonstratively unfair to you that you could play games. Now, again, that doesn't include Chilul Hashem. It still might be even more forbidden because of Chilul Hashem, but we don't censor. That's what this says. Does this ever come up? Not really, not today, not in America. You can't argue, well, we have a progressive tax system in America, right? If you make $50,000 a year, you're paying $2,000 in taxes. If you make $500,000 a year, you're paying $50,000 in taxes. So they're not doing it. No, but as long as there is a system, in fact, the Shulchan Aruch says, even if there's a special tax just on Jews, you can't cheat. As long as among the Jews, they treat it equally. So right now we see about taxes. In fact, I realized something amazing. Look at the next source from Esther. We're in the month of Adar. How does the story of Esther end? So oddly, it ends. It ends with a tax. What is going on here? Why in the end of this amazing story, it tells us about tax law. And I think, and I looked around on Shabbos and Baruch Hashem, I saw other Rishonim who say the same idea. We wanted to demonstrate the authority of Mordechai as the Mishnah Lamelech, and the only way to show your authority is by enforcing taxes. So the idea of us having to pay taxes is an obligation of Dina Dmalchusa Dina. It is a legitimate operation of a government. And in fact, Mordechai HaTzadik allowed this to happen to show his own authority. So let's go on. Next source. That's source number one in the Gemara. We're going to go through all the sources. These are all the times in Shas. We're not skipping any, I don't believe, except for Basar. Every time Dina Dmalchusa Dina is mentioned. The next time, let's read the Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Gittin. Kol hashtaros ha'olam b'arkos shel goyim. All contracts that come out of secular courts, and you don't have to follow inside if you don't want to. Afal pi shechos meim goyim, even though the contracts were signed by non-Jewish Gentile witnesses, ksherim, they are kosher. Chutz migitei noshim, except for divorce documents. Rabbi Shimon Omer, af elu ksherim, even a divorce done in secular court is allowed. Don't get excited. It doesn't mean what the Gemara was, as the Gemara is immediately going to say in the Mishnah. What it's talking about, because we don't have time, let me just say it outside, that anything even similar to a get. What does the Gemara mean? There are two types of contracts in the Gemara's eyes. There's a self-imposed contract. I make a deal with you that on Tuesdays and work, I'm always going to wear a yellow shirt. But then there are boilerplate pro forma contracts, titles, licenses, mortgage. So you would think, okay, I understand a secular court's order to a contract that you and I made together with two Gayusha witnesses, that has purchase and halacha. But certainly a title, if you don't do it, you should do it in a beis din. But if you don't, that pro forma has to come from a beis din. You can't. So the Gemara says, no, even standardized documentation, whether it's lechatchila or b'di'eved, certainly ex post facto is allowed. So now we see taxation and the legal thrust, that general legal power in business, monetary law, government has. Number three source, Baba Kama. Amar Shmuel, Dina Dmalchusa Dina, Amar Rabba Teda, Dekatli Dikli. When a government comes and they cut down trees, the Goshrei Gishrei, and they go ahead and build bridges, Vavrina Alahu, and it's for us to cross it, right? That's all okay. A government has the right of taxation, monetary law, eminent domain. This is the idea of eminent domain. So Abaye says maybe they really don't have a right. The fact that there's a Mishnah or a Brisa that assumes that the government now owns the bridge, even though it took it from my backyard, is because of the law of Yush. I was forlorn. I gave up title through my emotional state. So the Gemara says, no, what are you talking about? There's Heichi Miyashi. That's not how Yush works. This would be an act of theft unless the government has the right of eminent domain. So what do we have so far? We have taxation, monetary law, we have eminent domain. In fact, to show you that the government derives at least some of its authority from the goodwill it does for the people, let's turn to a Gemara, a very famous Gemara. You could relax because you all know it. You can just listen outside in Shabbos, which doesn't seem to be here. Shabbos 33. Did anybody see it on the page? Okay, I'll tell it to you. Oh, I think I only did it in English. Yes. So on the bottom, on number 17. No. Okay, I'll say it to you. I'll say it to you. So the Gemara on Shabbos Daf Lamed Gimel, very famous Gemara. With Shimon Bar Yochai, we know spent 12 years in a cave. He spent with his son Rabbi Elazar. We say every Tisha B'Av that Rabbi Elazar, according to many opinions, is Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, who composed many of our poems. Why did he hide in a cave? Well, the Romans were going to kill him. Well, why him? Well, they didn't allow learning Torah, but everybody else was somehow surviving. Does anybody remember the story? He criticized the government. They were sitting and talking, and I wish I could read it to you because it's such a powerful Gemara. They were saying, look at our taxes. They go to build bridges. They go to build tunnels, all these things that we get to use. And Shimon Bar Yochai says, they don't do that for us. They do it to collect taxes. They built the Throg's Neck so they could pay for the new Shea Stadium. It's probably true.
But they had to pay for the Throg's Neck.
It was an investment. It was worth spending the money so they could.
They paid the Throg's Neck bridge over.
By the way, I coming from Canada. Canada, if you know Canada a little bit, there's the 405. It's a new concept of a paid highway. The idea of the amount of taxes you pay in the city to live, that on top of that to use the roads, you just we're like toads boiled in water. We don't even realize it. It doesn't make any sense. I always say I'm a libertarian. I say that because I think everybody should be honest with the crowd where their political leanings are. So I am a libertarian, but I'm not an anarchist. You need taxes, but it's crazy. I give the example of a principal of a yeshiva, and one day he's late, and the next day he's late, and they ask him, why are you late? And he says, I was visiting someone in the hospital on Sunday, and I saw this old man. He has no family, a Jew. He's all alone. I go to visit him. Oh, wow, that's really nice of you. A few weeks later, he continues being late. And they say, look, at a certain point, you have to do your job. It's not that it's not for you to go. You have to be here. And we're at the point that we give so much with taxes to support, which is true. We should support those that are downtrodden. But to the point that our real job is not being done, roads and bridges, we need new taxes because the money's going elsewhere. I don't know. It's not a political class. I will say one thing about New York is you don't want the traffic to be out of hand. So there is an advantage of taxation on the bridges. Although again, that's what a government's supposed to give. And what I just said is what Shimon Bar Yochai said. Shimon Bar Yochai said they're just doing it to make money to support all their programs. To which he had, there was a snitch of Yehuda, the Gemara doesn't give him the name Rav for obvious reasons. And Yehuda tells the government, and he says, the people who were silent are going to get this punishment. You who defended us are going to get riches, and we're going to kill Shimon Bar Yochai. The point of that Gemara is, again, that everybody agreed that taxation for the purpose of road and bridges is okay. So Dina Dmalchus, Dina, taxes, contracts, and eminent domain, and paying extra taxes so that you could have roads and bridges. Another example, number 18, the Aruch HaShulchan, number 4 or 5. You could use minted funds for mitzvot. A government, Dina Dmalchusa Dina, doesn't just extend to taxes, to their court system, if you should make the mistake, at times the mistake to go there, or to bridges and tunnels, their ownership of and eminent domain, but also coinage. You have a right to accept their money, and halacha accepts their money. Now, Dina Dmalchusa Dina, does that mean that to buy crypto is problematic? I don't know, maybe. Not to support their coinage, but this is Dina Dmalchusa Dina. The question when you go to Eretz Yisrael, it's not so much anymore today. It used to be, when I was learning in Eretz Yisrael, the difference between exchanging funds in the bank and exchanging funds, Hamev and Yavin, was enormous. And it's a real shayla and halacha. So that doesn't understand. So when they're on the streets of Eretz Yisrael, there used to be, but there still is, black market exchange. So $1 American will give me 3 shekalim, let's say, in the bank. If I exchange on the street, I'll get $3.50.
Now it's regulated. You have to give your address when you change any of those.
Oh, really?
Yeah, any of the money.
So that's a serious shayla. Let's go on. Another example. So here's a Gemara in Sanhedrin. Now here's the big one. Did they have a right to make enforcements that seem arbitrary? This may lead to mandates. This may lead to stopping protests. Now again, you could have your own opinion, but does halacha sanction? Let's see. Tanya Belozman Yaakov Omer Shemati Shebastin, that a Jewish court, Makin va'onshim, they could punish corporally, Shalom in Torah, not based on Torah law. Just to make offense. There was a story with one person, says the Gemara, he broke the laws of Muktzah by handling an animal on Shabbos, in the days of the Yavanim, they stoned him. Says the Gemara, not because he deserved it. We said in the Gemara share yesterday, sometimes an eis la'asos means you should be lenient. It's a difficult time, help save Yiddishkeit, so we're extra lenient. But as you see from the Gemara again, sometimes eis la'asos means we have to go the other way. What does that have to do with our discussion? Because the Ran and many other Rishonim say extra judicial power is not just given to our courts of law, but to any Torah-sanctioned court of law, including secular authorities. Should the law of Dmalchusa apply to them by minting, by taxes, by bridges, by eminent domain, by shtaros, then punishment as well. We spoke about this when we talked about sexual abuse, and that there's no prohibition, as painful as it is, when you know, not when you hear rumors, when you know someone is being abused, to go to the authorities, even though, and I need aid in prison, those that are there for that reason are very unsafe. Prisoners have their own moral compass, and it agrees with us on this, and people get really injured. But nevertheless, at times, halacha will sanction that happening. Not sanction that happening, but we wouldn't, that wouldn't stop us, certainly. Okay, one more Gemara. Nida, Hanu b'nei Galila, this is number 19. The Nafak Alahu Kala the Kotel Nafsha, also look at the Bitar for Amalei Lemetron, Marmalu Haichinavad. There are people in the Galilee that there was a rumor that they had killed someone, so they come to Tarfon to hide, right? As was a murder suspect. So imagine you're a Rav of a shul, and Neil Stein knocks on your door and he's panting. He says, "Please, you heard about the double murder and the thing last night. Can I hide in your basement?" So Tarfon says, well, you would think he would say, Dina Dmalchus Dina, I can't hide you. I can't aid and what? Aid and abetting accessory after the fact. There's a lawyer. But he doesn't say that. He says, if I hide you, I'm also going to get killed. So Rashi says, you know why he said that? Because this was a case that everybody knew he was a scapegoat. The Jew wasn't even in town, and they were just wanting to kill a Jew. And of course, because the Nazis said, I need your gabbai, doesn't mean you give it over to them. So that's the case. And we see from Rashi that other than that, Dina Dmalchusa Dina extends to punishment. So now, these are all the Gemaras. In fact, look at Rashi. Maybe, he writes, you are guilty. Therefore, I can't hide you. So again, if he really thought he was innocent, then he could. So we have everything. That's every Gemara, always in the name of Shmuel, of Dina Dmalchusa Dina. It is one small facet of halacha, but it comes up over and over again. How does the Rambam codify it? Let's turn the page and read the Rambam together. I do have the Rambam here, right? Yes, I do. Okay. So, or do I not have the Rambam? Is the Rambam not on there? Good. We don't have time anyway. So I'll just tell you, the Rambam basically covers everything in a very interesting way. He says that a government has the power, and they have the power through consent, to tax a significant amount of our income, and it is forbidden to hide from those taxes. A government has the power of eminent domain. A government has the power to punish. However, there are times that this doesn't apply. What is malchusa and what isn't? When it's done unfairly, they certainly cannot steal. That's the basics, just a basic review as the Rambam does. Now, before we're landing the plane, because now we gave this introduction, we gave the sources, we have to ask one more question to get into this world of Dina Dmalchusa. And with this, once we say this, we can land the plane. What is the reason for this law? It's a very simple question, because we don't know the source, and most say it's biblical. And now that we know what power they have and when they don't have it, if we could just know the source of this law, we could start applying it or not to speeding tickets, to bankruptcy law, to other issues. So there are 7 opinions, believe it or not. And we're not going to go through them all, but I'll go through 4, 5, or 6, or 7 of them, depending on the time. So the first opinion comes from the Rashbam. The Rambam, that apparently I don't have in the handout, and Hilchos Gezela Perek Hey Halacha Yudches also seems to say this. The Ramban Yevamah says this. The Gura and the Choshe Mishpat says this. What's the source? It comes from Novi. In Sefer Shmuel Aleph, Vayhi Kasher Zokin Shmuel. This is in the handouts, right? The last page. Vayhi Kasher Zokin Shmuel. Shmuel was older. V'yasma spun of Shaitan Yisrael, and his sons were judges. Vayhi Shem ben Noach. We can skip that. Pasuk Dalid. V'yiskabetzu Kol Ziknei Yisrael. The elder statesmen gather around Shmuel. V'yavo el Shmuel haramasa. V'yomer alav hine ata zakanta. You're getting old. Uvanechalo halcha b'derchecha. Your sons aren't following in your way. Ata, famous pasuk. Sima lanu melech l'shavteinu k'chol hagayim. Make us a king. The mistake, of course, was k'chol hagayim. They didn't want it just for themselves. They wanted to be like everybody else. A temptation in our private lives and in our traditional lives, always. V'yareh hadavar beini Shmuel. It looked very bad. Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, Shema b'kol ha'am. God says, Pasuk Zayin, listen to them. It's not you, it's me. I should be insulted, says God, because I'm their king. But look what he says. Vayomer Shmuel, Pasuk Yud, Es kol divrei Hashem el ha'am, Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayomer zeh yeh mishpat ha'melech Hashem l'chaleim zbeichem, yikach v'samlei b'machei, fine, you can make him a king in chariots. Pasuk 12, U'lasim le'sarei alafim, he's going to have many underlings. You're going to have to be working for him to make things. He has the right to enforce who gets which job. He produce, he could tax. He could divide up among how he wants. Basically, he goes through, if you want to see it in English, if you turn the page at the very end, he says, the day will come when you will cry out because the king who you chosen over yourself is not answering you. But the people did not listen to Shmuel, and they said, we must have a king over us. So says the Vilna Gaon and the Rambam. This pasuk, there are two ways to look at it. This is a king will do these bad things that he's not allowed to do, or Hashem gave the power of a king to do these things. Sometimes they're wrong things, but he has the power to do them. And the Gra and the Rambam take that view. Shmuel was informing them that God, in the creation of the universe, allowed the concept of a leader, and that leader, for whatever understandable reason, has power to do all these things. So if you choose a Melech Yisrael, this is the power he's going to have. He could abuse it. Dina Dmalchusa Dina. That's the view, believe it or not, of many. In fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin wonders if this is an abuse or not, but we follow the view that it's not an abuse. Okay, next view is tshuva. We have to go through this quickly. It's a pasuk. If you look in Nehemiah, we don't have time. There's another pasuk in Nehemiah. That's another source that Hashem gave authority to them to rule. But let's now get to more intellectual reasons. Why would you think they have this power? Because knowing the reasons why help us with application. So the Rashba, the Nemukah Yosef, and the Ritva say it's very simple. They won wars. A war, right, noble, ethical, or otherwise, was fought. The battle was won. They took possession over this land. You, by moving to America, are purchasing land from the American army and George Washington. And he decided, in fact, they asked George Washington if he wanted the name king. I'm sure you know that history. Beautifully, he chose the president. Beautifully, he gave the first inkling of term limits. But it was his land. And he decided, here's how I'm dividing it up. And here's what the rights I'm going to give you, or better yet, that God gave you that I'm not going to infringe upon. That's a great answer. So you think about it, a king is like a landlord. A president is like a landlord. And they're just being passed down each generation. For this reason, the Chazon Ish and many Rishonim, it's not political, say this doesn't apply in Israel. The state of Israel does not have Dina Dmalchus Dina, because if the reason, it's a big machlokus, by the way, even among Dati Leumi, this is a very well-known machlokus. Doesn't mean you could steal taxes in Israel. It's still usher, but maybe not because Dina Dmalchus Dina, for an obvious reason. The land of Israel did not come to the Jews because of a war. There was no, it's not because of Ben Gurion. It is that we have a state and we're very thankful, but our connection to Israel came from God. And therefore, there is no concept of a landlord here that I'm not renting it from the state of Israel. I have an inherited right. Very interesting, isn't it? If that's the reason, okay? That's reason 3 why they give for Dina Dmalchusa Dina. We should know that whereas the Chazon Ish felt this way, Rabbi Yashiv did not. Rabbi Yashiv felt that among other reasons, Dina Dmalchusa Dina does apply in Israel. Okay, let's skip to a few more. The Even HaEzel will do one last thing. The Even HaEzel was a very famous commentary to the Rambam written by Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer, the leading Rosh Yeshiva in Europe and then in Eitz Chaim in Eretz Yisrael. You may know his son-in-law, Rabbi Aaron Kotler. Isser Meltzer was really the undisputed in the entire world at that time, Mizrahi Yeshiva, one of the great Rosh Yeshivas, brilliant mind. And in Even HaEzel, he says, you know where Dina Dmalchusa Dina comes from? There's no pasuk for it. Dina Dmalchusa Dina comes from a very simple rule. Non-Jews have 7 Noachite laws. One of those laws is to set up systems of courts. For you to live in a non-Jewish society and not follow their system of courts is a breach of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitei Nichshel. Just like a Jew cannot cause a Jew to sin, so too a Jew cannot cause a non-Jew to sin. You are obligated to help support the system that the Torah requires of them. So now we have everything. Right now, you know every Gemara and almost every reason behind Dina Dmalchusa Dina. Now the question is, how do you apply it? Number 1, according to many opinions, government is only allowed to apply what was applied always. Meaning when I moved to the country and this is the system of the government, that's what you have to keep. But if tomorrow, according to some opinions, let's say we start with a flat tax. According to many opinions, maybe that, you still have to do it because of Chil Hashem. Maybe then you can say that's a change. I didn't sign up for this. Another interesting aspect is, which they discuss, or Herschel Schachter discusses this. I'll put this on him because I don't want to get in trouble for this. Halachically, I have to pay my fair share of taxes. That's when the government knows something. But am I obligated to tell the government? So I'll give you an example. You go chas v'sholem to a casino and you win more than $10,000, right? I think $10,000 is the limit.
600.
Is 600? Maybe I made the mistake on purpose so no one thinks that I would. But whatever it is, who here really quickly calls their accountant? Or a Rav. A Rav, there is this minhag that because we don't have time, you could sell your chametz yourself. You don't have time. You ask the rabbi, can you do it for me? But the rabbi's busy too. So you know what, Rabbi, I'll give you, I'll pay you to do it. You know, it's Erev Pesach, you're busy. So the rabbi gets these checks. He has to declare taxes. Does he? Halachically? I spoke to an accountant. Legally, it's taxable income. Am I required to notify? Meaning when the government is aware I have to pay or it's out in the open, that's one thing. Am I obligated to notify? Herschel Schachter gives both views. Again, because of Chil Hashem, I would say, of course, you're obligated. But to go out of your way to tell them, as a doctor, there are many cases where this comes up. It's hard to say that that's a breach of Dina Dmalchusa Dina. So, okay, so now let's try to apply it. I know we discussed a lot. I really just wanted to give everybody a more complete, true understanding of Dina Dmalchusa Dina. Let's now apply this. Speeding. No matter what the reason is for Dina Dmalchusa Dina, you are obligated to keep speeding laws. Now, obviously, if it's assumed that you could go about 7 miles above, it's 65, you go 72, 55, you go 70, 61. That's okay, because they certainly, it's their roads. It's coercive, but it's also voluntary. We all want roads that have this right. And there's no way around it. Halachically, it's a breach of law. When it comes to paying taxes, it's a Mishnah. You are absolutely halachically obligated to do so. Are there times when the poskim say, in fact, we don't pass them like the Ramah, if they make a mandate and they treat Jews different, I am going to say this, whatever you felt about the vaccine mandates, there's no question they treated yeshivas, at least in New York, differently, and maybe you feel they should. But that Dina Dmalchusa Dina thereby gets broken. There may be other reasons that you should follow it. I'm not saying, we're not commenting what you should or shouldn't do. But at that point, as soon as they treat one part of society different, we paskin, the Dina Dmalchusa Dina falls away. You cannot claim that there's a social contract here. At that point, it gets taken away. Number 3, whenever Dina Dmalchusa Dina counters Torah, it goes out the window. However, When it comes to monetary law, like we saw from the Mishnah of Shtaros, there's a concept of minhag. So, for example, if I lend you money and we live in a significant amount of money for a business, and we live in a society of bankruptcy, you know that, and I know that. It's not that Dina Dmalchusa Dina overwhelms the halacha. It's that because we all know that in this society, that's how it operates, there's a silent contract at times in monetary law. So this comes up in Beis Din all the time. If there are cases that I may owe you money based on the Mishnah, but in societal practice, we don't require the person to pay. The classic example is a waiter or a waitress. You're a caterer, and they break plates. Now, halachically, they have to pay. But a frum waiter could say to the frum caterer that the minhag ha'olam is that this is daily usage, this is typical usage, or whatever the term they use, I don't know, and I'm not obligated. So, bankruptcy is a little bit more complicated. You may go to a Beis Din, but a Beis Din, you should always go to a Beis Din. A Beis Din is very well aware of this. A good Beis Din knows secular law very well. When it comes to monetary law, they have to, at least to know what the assumption is of each person. Let's say you build a sukkah, and you build a sukkah in a place that's not yours. So, for example, you have an apartment building, there's nowhere, so you go out into the foyer, the front yard, without asking permission, you build a sukkah. The Mishnah Brura says, you are yotzei the mitzvah of sukkah, but you transgressed Dina Dmalchusa Dina. The case of the lemonade stand. If it's a social construct, lemonade stand is fine. Everybody knows that the reason for the zoning law is not for this. It's not for this. If the reason is coercion, then maybe this is illegal, except if it's because you're coerced, if that's where the power comes from. If the state doesn't enforce this, and everybody assumes that this was not part of the law, then it would be allowed. So actually the reasons affect. A lot of it is what they enforce. Just because something is on the books does not create the Dmalchusa Dina. Counter Torah could affect monetary law if it's assumed that you're following it. And if they don't enforce it, it might be legal. That's why the poskim say you can go 72. You just can't go over where it's considered speeding. All of this is because of Golus. We'll end with the story. Rabbi Kamenetsky was a young rabbi in Russia. I said the story before. It's a wonderful story. And someone came to him and said, Rabbi, I went to the post office and I bought 3 stamps, but they gave me change as if I bought 1 stamp. So he said, you have to return it. So the student said, the balabas said, but there's a law of Gnevas Akum. Now, I want to tell you something before we go on. Gnevas Akum, there's something called Chalav Akum. Gnevas Akum almost never exists. The idea that Walmart, that I forgot under my Walmart thing that I have a case of seltzer, it's a toas akum, therefore I could keep it, it's geneva. Stealing the pasuk lesignev, according to the Gemara, applies equally to Jew and Gentile alike. I've said many times that the websites that when LL makes a mistake and it's $50 round trip, and everybody runs to buy them, hasn't happened in a long time, it is absolutely usher to purchase that ticket. And not just because it's a Jew and it's like he dropped his wallet in the street, so you have to give it back to him. But he's the owner of LL, I could keep it? No. Or they're going to honor my ticket afterwards. So what? If I can't steal from you based on the assumption that you may forgive it afterwards. And if it's Delta Airlines, it's not just a question of Geneva. I want you to listen closely. Even if Dina Dmalchusa Dina allows you to purchase that mistake, a family member took that flight to Hawaii, like $100 round trip, and I asked him, what was the plane like? 90% hats and yarmulkes. What is a stewardess from Arkansas going to think about Jews? So Rabbi Yaakov said, return the money. So they go and return the money. And it turns out this guy was an anti-Semite, the postmaster general, whatever his position was. And he would keep giving Jews extra change, but they all just gave it back because that was a psak of the Rav. He ended up saving that town and Rabbi Yaakov when World War II began. We have to be very, very careful. So Dina Dmalchusa Dina, that is the essence of the background. I hope you now have a fuller understanding. It took a long time. That was an hour share, and we only, as you see, touched the surface. We'll take questions, but may we lead to the day that we're not in Golus. And it's Dina Dmalchusa Dina should turn into Hashem Melech, Hashem Molech, Hashem Yimloch, the Olam Vaed, that the only Malchus that whose dinim we follow is that of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So thank you all for coming. Have a happy President's Day, everybody. If you have any questions, go ahead.
Well,
Yeah.
You touched on Israel, but really, you know, how this really applies in Israel versus the rest of the US.
Right. So there are two issues when it comes to Israel. One is a Jewish king versus a non-Jewish king. If Joe Lieberman was vice president and then became president, then we have.
Question.
Yeah, I'm just answering one question.
We couldn't hear it on Zoom.
The question was if I could expand upon the laws of Dina Dmalchusa Dina in Israel. So there are really two issues. Number one is a Jewish leader in and outside of Israel. That's issue one. And issue two is a Jewish or a non-Jewish leader in Israel. So in Israel, the issue isn't that they're Jewish or not. It could be a non-Jewish prime minister or a Jewish prime minister. Halachically, we follow the Tzitz Eliezer, Vad Yosef, and most others, that even in Israel, there is a law of Dina Dmalchusa Dina. That's because even though it's true that the power the government has is not through war, as we all have a right to the land of Israel as Jews, that's a promise made to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but rather the social construct. Chazal understood, there's a term that Reform Jews use all the time. It's called tikkun olam. And tikkun olam is a halachic term. It's misused by the rest of the world. So an example of tikkun olam is even though a deaf mute cannot make an acquisition, when it comes to marriage, we allow their marriage to work because of tikkun olam. So it means the continuance of the world. Not about picking up garbage in the street. It's about you need a society that runs legally. That's the true. So because of tikkun olam, some say that's where Dina Dmalchusa Dina comes from. And the pasuk in Shmuel was about what? Eretz Yisrael. So you see that the social contract for tikkun olam, for world order, that we all take part of. So it doesn't make a difference in Israel or out of Israel. So you have to follow Dina Dmalchusa Dina. You'll notice, I'm sure there's maybe nobody here who agrees with protests against yeshiva students in the army, but why are they protesting? Just somehow get around it. Whatever you want to say about them, they don't want to break Dina Dmalchusa Dina. When I was in yeshiva, my Rosh Yeshiva refused to take a penny from the government, not because he's anti-government, quite the contrary. He felt that the risk of stealing even $1 from the government is a breach in Dina Dmalchusa Dina, so he took none. In fact, even my Rebbe in Passaic, New Jersey, Mayor Stearns, didn't take Pell Grants. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. He doesn't take because he's afraid of breaching Dina Dmalchusa Dina and afraid of breaching Chilul Hashem. Yes. By the way, we didn't discuss particular cases, so any question is acceptable. Go ahead.
So there can be many instances where it's just not clear whether Dina Dmalchusa Dina is
true.
Meaning the government is just or not. I'll give you an example. I have
I'll repeat the question when he finishes.
a Russian friend that almost died of COVID, and he was saying over the amount of time, I'll never get vaccinated. So I said, okay, I just let it go. And he said to me, when I was young in Russia, they forced vaccines on me, and it limited the strength of my body because of horrible vaccines that I took. And I don't trust any system of a government where they impose a vaccine mandate on you. So to him, how does a Rav answer such a question?
It's a great question. Yeah, he asked, for those who didn't hear, focusing on the vaccines, he knows someone who grew up in a communist country and who had COVID, so he believes that he's immune, I guess, and feels, due to his own background, that he cannot trust putting something into his body that's unproven. I mean, it's a Gemara. The Gemara says, and we all know this, there's no perfect drug. The Gemara says the problem with drugs is one of two things. It's good for one part, but it's always bad for another part, which is true. You could die from Tylenol. And also you could become addicted and become a robber. I don't think we're worried about addiction with vaccines. And the risk seems to be minimal. But you have someone who had this background and he goes to a Rav and says, do I have to follow the mandate? Well, first of all, there are no mandates. The government does not mandate anywhere. Yeah, in fact, if you go back to the smallpox vaccine under the Bush administration in 2002, all the news reports was very clear. This is we push it. We want you to do it. but you have to make your own decision for your family. The mandates by this vaccine is more begrama. Like if you want to work in the post office, if you want to work for the, whatever it is. So, it's unfair. Even the truckers in Canada, there's no mandate in Canada for the vaccine. It's not true. There's a mandate that if you want to cross the border, yes, but of course there's an argument. So how would a Rav answer that? So again, a Rav, I'll tell you two things. Number one is we all know and want doctors to break law. There's an organization called Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders, by their definition, lies, cheats, and steals to get into countries they're not supposed to be and to provide medication they're not supposed to provide. So the idea of leaving the vaccines aside, the idea of lying to a government for your own protection, of course, your own life takes precedence. Now, a personal decision, halacha, I'm not pasking. I would try to urge the person to get vaccinated. However, we should keep in mind the halacha. Shulchan Aruch states that if a professional doctor tells you to do something, do you have to listen? Yes. Does halacha respect the professional doctor? Absolutely. But 100 professional doctors say that you could fast on Yom Kippur. What's the one way to eat on Yom Kippur? If the patient himself says, I can't explain it, but I feel halacha takes very seriously the words of a patient. And so, halacha doesn't have a comment. If you believe your life is at risk, there's no Dmalchusa. Is he right? That's a separate issue. But when it comes to medicine, and it's not, and anyway, there's no mandate. So halachically, like Shabbos, if your life's at risk, you could do what you want. But I'm not saying he's right that his life's at risk. But a government certainly has no right, halachically, when it comes to medicines. However, we should point out that Tiferes Yisrael writes, not by a mandate. He says when Dr. Jenner, he wasn't really the inventor of the smallpox vaccine. And again, that kept 2002, but a very crude smallpox vaccine. People did die from the vaccine. And the Tiferes Yisrael writes, you still have to take it. He says, even if the chance is not insignificant, Tiferes Yisrael writes, you're still obligated to take it because you will save billions and billions. It's an amazing Tiferes Yisrael. He writes, he calls it inoculation. We gave a share on this a few years ago. So the shaila of not taking the vaccine by a mandate, the Dina Dmalchus is negligible, because if it's dangerous, it doesn't even apply. The real question is, halachically, are you obligated to take what you think is a risk to save others? And that is a whole different discussion. The Ravid, you get a phone call from an organization that does bone marrow transplant matches, and you're a match, and they tell you, you can save a young mother, 32 years old, 100% you'll save her life, but there's a 30% chance you'll die on the operating table. Are you obligated to do it? No. What about a 20%? 10, 9, 1, 0.5. Very difficult. Rabbi Moshe, the Minchas Yitzchak, they deal with it. So again, for those listening, I'm not commenting about the vaccine per se. Certainly, if a patient feels a certain way, right or wrong, halacha wants to give him that power. However, if it's going to affect others, meaning if people are seeing breakthrough COVID from those who have the vaccine and wear a mask, now we have a different type of shaila. So, any other questions? Have a wonderful day. We want to say thank you in this era of political correctness. I hope I'm not going to get in trouble of saying we want to thank the presidents of these United States for fighting for our freedoms, from George Washington on out, the kavod they had to Torah, the respect they had for Jews. We've never had a gullus like this. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bless each president, whatever political party, in this case, President Biden, with health and with wisdom. And that wisdom should only have them make decisions that are beneficial for Jews and for Eretz Yisrael. Have a good day.
Bye, Rabbi.